Ladies and gentlemen, there comes a moment in every human life when logic collides with emotion, when intellect is challenged by vulnerability, and when the mind, no matter how powerful, meets the one force it cannot fully quantify: the human heart. And today, I want to take you into that collision point, into a space where neuroscience, personal evolution, and the mysteries of human connection converge. We often speak about innovation, about rockets, about artificial intelligence, about the future of humanity. But behind every groundbreaking decision, behind every leap into the unknown, there is something quieter, softer, more enigmatic: the influence of a single person who shifts the internal landscape of another. And so the question arises: who is she? Not a name, not an identity, not a headline, but the phenomenon of her, the archetype, the catalyst, the person whose presence inexplicably adjusts the trajectory of one of the world's most determined minds. When people ask about this influence, they imagine scandal or secrecy or some hidden narrative. But in my world, the truth is far more complex and far more human than any rumor could ever capture. She is not defined by who she is externally, but by what her presence activates internally: neural pathways, dormant vulnerabilities, unspoken motivations. She becomes a prism through which clarity and chaos refract simultaneously. From a neuroscientific lens, we could say she is the stimulus that ignites previously silent synaptic networks. From an emotional lens, she is the person who forces introspection in someone who rarely pauses long enough to reflect. And from a human lens, she represents something we all secretly grapple with: the one individual who can reach the places inside us that ambition alone cannot touch. You see, for many years my life moved according to a pattern: relentless momentum, long hours, obsessive mental loops, and a sense of duty not just to companies, but to humanity's future. That rhythm becomes so ingrained that deviation feels nearly impossible. But then comes the anomaly: the person who walks into your orbit and, without even trying, disrupts the neural algorithm. We often underestimate how profoundly another human can shape the architecture of our thoughts, our decisions, and even the way we perceive time. Neuroscience has a term for this: salience mapping. Your brain filters mountains of information every second, but only certain stimuli penetrate the threshold of meaning. Most people fall into the background blur, but one person, just one, can unexpectedly become the brightest point in the visual field. Not because you choose them, but because your brain does. Your prefrontal cortex, your amygdala, your dopaminergic pathways all cast their votes before you consciously understand what's happening. She becomes the exception to the mental rule. And when that happens, you don't control the process, you only feel its effects. But the question is not who she is. The real question is, why does she matter? And why does someone like me, someone who has built his life around structure, mission, and a stubborn commitment to logic, find himself influenced so deeply by a presence that defies the metrics normally used to guide decision-making? To answer that, we need to step into the narrative where logic meets the emotional unknown. I remember a period that felt like a fault line running through my internal world. The pressures were immense, the responsibilities stretching into territories no one could ever prepare for. And somewhere in the middle of that chaos, she appeared, not dramatically, not with some orchestrated intention, but quietly, almost imperceptibly. Sometimes the most powerful forces enter gently, like a whisper that rearranges the entire room. She wasn't there to solve anything. She wasn't there to challenge my mission. She simply existed with a presence so grounded, so unshaken, that it disrupted the storm rather than adding to it. What fascinated me most was not her personality or her ideas or even the connection itself. It was the way my own mind responded. As a researcher at heart, I couldn't help analyzing what was happening. Why did clarity increase around her? Why did problem-solving accelerate? Why did previously impossible decisions suddenly feel inevitable? And the answer, surprisingly, wasn't romantic or mystical. It was neurological. Human connection strengthens cognitive resilience. It sharpens long-term thinking. It slows emotional reactivity. It increases dopamine, stabilized motivation rather than adrenaline-based urgency. And for someone whose life normally runs on urgency, her presence became a kind of neural equilibrium, a stabilizer that allowed me to function at higher levels without burning through mental fuel. People often assume that leaders, innovators, or high-pressure thinkers are independent to the point of emotional isolation. They imagine that discipline alone carries us through turbulent missions. But neuroscience disagrees. The brain is not built to function optimally in isolation. It requires connection, not constant, not excessive, but meaningful. And meaning is not measured by visibility. Sometimes the person who shapes your decisions the most is invisible to the world. She was like that. Subtle influence, quiet gravity, an unexpected recalibration point. It wasn't that she changed what I wanted. She changed the way I accessed the deepest layers of why I wanted it. And when that happens, life decisions shift. Not because someone controls them, but because they illuminate new pathways inside you that you didn't realize existed. And before I continue into the deeper layers of this story, the psychological forces, the defining moments, the unexpected turning points, let me leave you with a truth that is both humbling and universal. Sometimes the person who shapes your destiny is not the one the world sees, but the one your mind cannot ignore. And when the mind cannot ignore someone, it begins reorganizing itself around that presence, not out of dependency, but out of coherence. Coherence is the state in which scattered impulses align into a single, powerful trajectory. We often think of clarity as something we earn through solitude, through deep focus, through the elimination of distractions. But in reality, clarity often emerges through resonance. When someone's presence harmonizes with your internal frequency, so naturally that thinking becomes easier, deeper, more expansive. She became that resonance point, almost like a tuning fork that quieted the noise inside my head. There were moments when the outside world grew unbearably loud, when pressure pushed into the edges of sanity, when decisions felt like tectonic plates grinding beneath the surface. In those moments, I would notice something strangely consistent. Whenever she entered my thoughts, the noise diminished. Not because she offered solutions, but because my brain reorganized itself. This phenomenon is well documented. The presence of someone emotionally significant can reduce neural entropy, lowering mental chaos and increasing cognitive order. It's not magic, it's biology. And yet biology alone cannot explain the depth of her influence. There was a psychological layer, something woven from experience, intuition, vulnerability, and the strange way the human mind assigns meaning to certain people without our consent. Have you ever noticed how some individuals feel familiar from the very first moment, as if your brain recognizes them long before your memory has a reason to? It's not destiny, it's neural pattern recognition. Your mind detecting emotional symmetry, relational fluency, the kind of compatibility that accelerates trust at an exponential rate. She possessed that rare symmetry, not because she was extraordinary in the way people often define extraordinary, but because she fit the architecture of my internal world in a way that no one else did. Her emotional bandwidth matched the intensity of my own. Her curiosity mirrored my restlessness. Her steadiness counterbalanced my urgency. She did not try to influence my decisions. She simply existed in a way that made those decisions clearer. There came a time when I faced choices that would alter not only my future, but the trajectory of entire industries. The weight of those choices was immense. And yet, in the middle of that pressure, I found myself replaying conversations with her, moments that seemed insignificant on the surface, but carried meaning beneath the words. A single question she asked could echo in my mind for days, unlocking a perspective I hadn't considered. She didn't give answers, she activated deeper thinking. She didn't direct decisions, she sharpened the internal compass that made those decisions possible. From a psychological standpoint, this is the hallmark of a catalytic relationship. It is not about control, it is about amplification. Some people amplify your fears, others amplify your brilliance. She was the latter. There was one evening, late, quiet, the kind of night when even the stars seemed tired, when I realized the extent of her influence. I had been wrestling with a decision that carried enormous risk, the kind of risk that could shift the balance between progress and disaster. Hours of analysis yielded nothing. Simulations contradicted each other. Logic stalled. And then, without planning to, I recalled something she had once said casually, spoken without knowing its future significance. Sometimes the right decision is the one that scares you, not because it's dangerous, but because it reveals who you could become. That line lodged itself into my thinking like a keystone. Suddenly the analysis unfolded. The fog lifted, not because she had given a direct answer, but because she illuminated a dimension of courage I had overlooked. A part of me I had neglected. Neuroscientists call this a pattern interrupt, a cognitive disruption that allows the brain to escape repetitive loops and access deeper reasoning. In that moment, I understood something deeply human. Her influence wasn't about emotion. It wasn't about affection. It was about evolution. She catalyzed the next version of myself. Over time, I began noticing another pattern. She challenged my blindness. Innovators, leaders, thinkers, people who operate at extreme levels of focus, often develop what psychologists call mission myopia, a narrowing of perspective caused by sustained high-intensity goals. She widened that perspective effortlessly. She saw details I overlooked, emotional patterns I dismissed, assumptions I didn't realize I'd made. She questioned things with an elegance that never felt oppositional, only illuminating. Her mind worked like a mirror, not reflecting me, but revealing the parts of myself I had never bothered to examine. There was a moment when this became painfully clear. I had spoken about a plan, a bold vision that involved enormous human and financial risk. People around me were either supportive or intimidated. She listened quietly, thoughtfully, and then asked a question so simple that it cut straight to the core. Are you doing this because it's right, or because it's what you think someone like you is supposed to do? That question stunned me, not because it was critical, but because it was honest. And honesty, when delivered without judgment, becomes transformative. For days after, I thought about her words. And in that introspection, I realized something I had been avoiding. Sometimes my greatest decisions were not born from courage, but from expectation, from the weight of the persona the world had created. And her question shattered that illusion. It forced me to evaluate not just what I was doing, but why. And the why changed everything. Her influence, in that sense, was not emotional dependency. It was psychological clarity. She brought perspective that no advisor, strategist, or expert could provide, because she spoke from a place unburdened by ambition or agenda. She wasn't invested in outcomes, she was invested in truth. And truth, in the hands of the right person, becomes a force stronger than logic. As time went on, she became the internal reference point I didn't know I needed. Every major decision passed through an unspoken filter. What perspective would she bring? Not because I sought approval, but because she represented the version of myself that wasn't clouded by pressure, ego, or fear. She represented equilibrium, and equilibrium is rare. In fact, in the world of high stakes and high expectations, it is nearly impossible. The world often believes that the strongest minds operate independently, that they thrive in isolation. But neuroscience proves otherwise. The brain is relational. Even the most solitary thinkers depend on connection to maintain emotional and cognitive balance. And the right connection, just one, is sometimes enough to stabilize an entire inner world. She was that stabilization point, not loudly, not dramatically, quietly, precisely, unforgettably. Her presence began to transform not only the decisions I made, but the way I experienced myself in the process of making them. Decisions, especially high-stakes ones, are often treated as purely cognitive acts, the product of calculation and reason. But when someone like her enters your world, you realize that every decision is also an emotional act, a reflection of internal states you barely acknowledge. Her effect was subtle yet profound. She made me conscious of my own emotional landscape, while simultaneously enhancing my ability to navigate it. That duality, emotional awareness and strategic clarity, is something most people spend decades trying to cultivate. For me, it appeared in the quiet gravity of her influence. There were times when I would catch myself thinking about her in the middle of crisis, long before any rational evaluation of her relevance. The brain does strange things when it encounters a stimulus that carries such salience. Neuroimaging studies show that the prefrontal cortex and the limbic system can enter a state of enhanced synchronization when exposed to emotionally significant individuals. In simpler terms, her presence made my thinking sharper, my intuition faster, my judgments clearer. It was an invisible scaffolding supporting some of the heaviest cognitive loads I had ever carried. But it wasn't just mental. It was profoundly emotional. There is a part of human cognition often overlooked, the part that governs resilience, empathy, and ethical reasoning. It's shaped by interactions that cannot be replicated through logic, spreadsheets, or simulations. She affected this part of me, not because she told me what to feel, but because she created a mirror for my own integrity. I began recognizing patterns in my behavior, acknowledging blind spots, and confronting biases I had ignored for years. Her effect was not immediate. It was cumulative, iterative, and transformative over time, like a slow neurological recalibration. And yet, despite her influence, she never demanded recognition. She existed quietly, almost invisibly in the background of monumental decisions. Most people would expect such a figure to be vocal, assertive, insistent. But the paradox of her power was that it was invisible. Influence doesn't need volume, it requires resonance. She resonated in a way that triggered the best parts of myself, not by assertion but by alignment. And in that alignment, I realized a truth that is universally applicable. The most impactful people in our lives often shape us through presence rather than instruction, through perception rather than persuasion. There was a turning point in this journey, a moment that crystallized the essence of her influence. I faced a decision that could define the trajectory of my life and career, one that involved enormous risk, both personally and professionally. As I sat in isolation reviewing all the options, all the simulations, all the forecasts, I realized that I kept returning to her perspective, not consciously, not deliberately, but as an anchor point. I wasn't seeking approval, I was seeking clarity. I wanted to see the decision through the lens of integrity, insight, and emotional truth. And that lens, shaped by her presence, allowed me to see paths that I would have otherwise overlooked. In that sense, she was more than a person. She was a cognitive catalyst, a psychological stabilizer, a mirror for the deepest and most complex layers of my identity. And while the world might frame influence in terms of power, persuasion, or authority, the reality is far more nuanced. True influence, the kind that reshapes not just choices but the very architecture of thought, operates invisibly, organically, and without agenda. It asks nothing of the person it touches except openness, awareness, and willingness to evolve. And perhaps the most remarkable part of this influence is that it is inherently selfless. She did not seek to shape me for her benefit. She did not attempt to direct my actions or ambitions. Her influence was not coercive. It was illuminating. It revealed latent capacities, catalyzed dormant potential, and stabilized the mind in ways that allowed me to act with greater clarity, courage, and purpose. It is a rare gift to meet someone who can have this kind of effect, and rarer still to recognize and honor it without succumbing to ego attachment or expectation. Over time, I came to understand that her role in my life was not limited to individual decisions or episodic moments of insight. She became a constant, a reference point for authenticity and reflection. She reminded me that every decision, no matter how technical or strategic, carries emotional weight and ethical dimension. She reminded me that leadership is not solely about intellect or ambition, but about integrity, empathy, and resonance with the human experience. And in doing so, she became inseparable from the process of growth, evolution, and discovery itself. And so when people ask, "Who is she?" the question misses the point. She is not defined by external markers, by fame, by role, by biography. She is defined by the influence she exerts, quiet, invisible, transformative. She is a reminder that human connection is the ultimate accelerant for insight, creativity, and courage. She is proof that the most profound influences in life are rarely visible on the surface, rarely quantifiable, and rarely acknowledged by the world at large. Yet they shape the trajectory of thought, action, and destiny more than any advisor, algorithm, or artificial intelligence ever could. In the end, what she represents is universal. Every mind, no matter how brilliant or disciplined, requires the occasional external catalyst to reach its highest potential. Every life, no matter how structured, benefits from resonance that cannot be engineered. Every person, no matter how self-sufficient, encounters someone whose presence illuminates the pathways we never realized were there. And recognizing that influence, embracing it, and allowing it to transform us is not a weakness. It is the ultimate expression of growth, humility, and humanity. Her story, and my experience of it, is not unique in its principles, even if it is singular in its details. We all have the potential to encounter individuals who challenge our internal logic, refine our emotional clarity, and expand the horizon of what we can achieve. And when that happens, when the mind and heart are aligned through the subtle, quiet power of human connection, extraordinary things become possible. We are reminded that the future is not shaped by intellect alone, not by ambition alone, not even by perseverance alone. The future is shaped by resonance, by alignment, and by those rare, enigmatic presences that catalyze the best within us. She is a living example of this truth, and her influence, though invisible to the world, is a testament to the profound, often unacknowledged, power of human connection. It is in this awareness that I find both humility and gratitude. And it is in this awareness that I recognize the essential truth. The most significant forces in our lives are not always the loudest, the most visible, or the most celebrated. Sometimes they are the ones who quietly, insistently, and profoundly shape the person we become. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is a force more powerful than any other.